March the 5th, 2022, and guess we'll get back to what seems to be dominating the news now is the ongoing war in Ukraine. And there's lots happened on this, and then there's some other issues coming up. Zelensky is going to be speaking to the Senate this morning, I guess, trying to encourage us to enter the war on his side. And we'll kind of get into that in a little bit too. And then we have to look at this discussion of the no-fly zone that keeps coming up all the time, which is kind of like a sort of a misleading phrase. I mean, we can kind of go into that too. So if you like these videos, please, subscribe, give me a like. You can ring the bell for notifications, and comments are appreciated. Okay, yeah, what I'd like to get into here on the no-fly zone idea, that's sort of like, okay, we declare a no-fly zone. So do you think the Russians are going to quit flying in it just because we declared it? I mean, I don't understand what these people are thinking. I guess they have no concept of military operations at all or what the consequences are. I mean, the no-fly zones we've had back in the 90s is mainly when it was the era of no-fly zones, I guess up to the Second Gulf War, were being imposed upon a defeated enemy whose air force had already been completely ravaged and had limited air defense also. And then basically what we were doing at some great effort was flying airplanes over these areas to prevent anybody from coming up and intercepting and shooting them down if they did, and bombing anti-aircraft units that might pop up here or there. Well, the situation in Ukraine is different. You've got the mass of the Russian military already deployed in Ukraine, who do have anti-aircraft systems that are quite sophisticated, much better than anything Iraq had or Libya had. And the Russian Air Force is far from defeated right now. It's taken a few losses. We're not sure exactly how many. I mean, I'm skeptical of what Ukrainians are saying, and I'm very skeptical of anything the Russians are saying. So it's kind of like both sides are playing propaganda. We all know that, so we don't know. But we've definitely seen some Russian planes going down, so we know they've shot down some, but not enough to really affect their overall combat ability. And the other question I would ask is NATO at this point really deployed to engage in such an action? And how long would it take them to get there? I mean, I'm still trying to check around to see if any F-22 units have been deployed to NATO yet. I mean, there's a couple of squadrons at Langley in Virginia that could be deployed, and that would be a big change in the dynamic. There are some F-35s in the hands of NATO allies, and I believe we brought in one F-35 squadron too, if I recall correctly. But these are the planes that could actually hope to operate in this no-fly zone environment that people are talking about. And remember, to keep a cap position up there all the time, you kind of have to have a lot of sorties being flown. And do we have enough planes to sustain it over an area that big? So, the other thing is the fourth generation planes that come in there, your F-15s and 16s, those sort of planes, some NATO planes, I guess Typhoons and Tornadoes, if they get in there, they will be subjected to surface-to-air attack at a minimum from Russian anti-aircraft assets, and probably will start bringing them down, at least a certain percentage. And the other thing you would have is that in air-to-air, the Russians are not trivial either. I would probably give the edge to NATO pilots, I would think, U.S. pilots, but the Russians are not that bad either, and they have their own equipment and their own doctrines. One thing you're going to face with the Russians is where they rely a lot on IRSTs on their system, particularly against the fifth generation planes. I'm doubtful how successful that'll be, and of course the F-35 is very sensor inclusive, and although it doesn't have quite the aerodynamic performance of the Russian jets, it has a lot of other neat features, including stealth, which, of course, if the Russians can't see them in time, But the thing is, I don't think we've deployed an adequate amount of this equipment in the area to maintain a no-fly zone anyhow. And like people have argued, if they fire missiles from Russian or Russian allied Belarus territory into Ukraine against these airplanes, do we then go start bombing Russian targets inside of Russia? I mean, That's what I'm trying to get to here, and I think people are not missing, is the question is, do we want to launch an air war with Russia or not? Essentially, do we want to enter the war on the side of Ukraine, at least in terms of air power? That's what's really being raised. It's not like we just magically say no fly and nobody flies. That's not what happens in this scenario. It is going to war with Russia, at least in the air. And of course, there's no guarantee once you go to war with Russia in the air, Russia don't go to war with you somewhere else. I mean, for instance, there are things they could do, and this thing could expand pretty dramatically. And it also, if a successful no-fly zone, I pointed this out in the previous video, I won't go into that again in any great detail, but if we were to successfully deploy large amounts of the U.S. Air Force capability in there, along with the RAF and so forth, and really seriously try to do a no-fly zone for real and really engage in that air war, okay, that's where I think you have the possibility of two things. One, Russia would see themselves literally under attack and would probably help Putin propaganda-wise. But on the other hand, that's where this nuclear threat, I think, does come into play. I don't think it's going to be used in any scenario in which, the Russians are basically winning the war. And even if it's costly and what you see on TV every day in Ukraine. But if the Russians are really facing a major military setback because NATO enters the war against them, which is essentially what this is, it's not a no-fly, it's an air war against Russia is what they're really talking about. And I think people need to understand it in those terms and say, is that where we want to go? And do we think we can contain it to just an air war against Russia? I mean, this could spread to a naval war, for example, fairly quickly. And in that case, we could literally take thousands of casualties if an aircraft carrier is wiped out. And then the Russian fleet would probably end up being wiped out too. I mean, what I'm saying is you'd end up having, other countries would become involved. I mean, what about Turkey? Does Turkey enter the war too now? Because, we would want to get into the Black Sea to get at the Russians. And you can see how this thing could spiral rather quickly into something pretty dramatically bad. And that's why I think this is a very bad idea. And that's why I think NATO is being pretty firm not to do it. The other thing is NATO kind of needs a unanimous vote, I think, in order to do this, unless some countries go, on their own, so to speak. And I don't think that's going to happen. Not enough of that. I just want to kind of raise I'm really annoyed at people saying, well, let's just have a no-fly zone. No, it's a lot more complicated than that. And it's very escalatory. Other than that, what we're sitting back and watching is just a murderous campaign by the Russians, I guess you'd say. But that's what the Russians do. I mean, this is the Russian way of war. I mean, the Russians, for one thing, we haven't ever really faced in the modern era, since Vietnam, let's say. I think Vietnam, and actually in Vietnam, I think we did a lot of things that are quite similar, in fact, to what Russia's doing in Ukraine at times when a hardened, NVA or VC area was attacked and fought back hard. End up, we had to destroy the village in order to save it. That did happen, and I kind of sat there at all these supposed war crimes. I mean, we've used thermal barrack bombs in Afghanistan, didn't we, against the caves where the Al-Qaeda was. We've used cluster bombs historically. Now it's verboten. So, I'm not for this. I'm just saying that you have to consider that the Russians are behind us technologically, obviously. I mean, I'm amazed that they've not been able to neutralize the Ukrainian Air Force, but now I would think was simply using spy satellite technology to identify any airfields where combat jets were positioned and attack them from the air when they were on the ground. And again, we don't know just exactly how many Ukrainian planes are really flying. I mean, I don't see a lot of evidence of that, really. And we don't know the time and place sometimes on some of these incidents. We do see that drones are flying, but even then, the drone attacks don't seem to be that massive. But they have done some damage. And it is something that's hard to deal with because they're small, hard to see on radar, but on the other hand, they drop a fairly small bomb, so they probably knock out one vehicle or two at a time. They're not really big area weapons like you could have if you got into a true NATO versus Russia war, for instance. Anyway, I thought I'd kind of get into that. It's but it is going to be a spiraling humanitarian crisis. One thing I would want to comment on is this attack on the reactor that was a big thing the other day. I guess it was Thursday night at our time anyhow. And I'm looking at this thing, and it's being misrepresented what's going on there. It doesn't look like the reactors were being shelled at all. What we really were seeing were illumination flares being dropped that were probably fired out of mortars, and they were just kind of slowly descending over the thing in order to give the attacking Russian troops visibility. And apparently the firefight was probably between that and Ukrainian defenders that were in the administration building shooting at them, and eventually the Russians took the facility and didn't damage the reactors. Now the real risk, of course, would have been that around these reactors you usually have these cooling pools where spent fuel rods are being left in water to cool down as the more radioactive elements in them, isotopes, are decaying. And if an artillery shell actually hit one of those and broke it open, you'd have some really nasty radioactive waste blown into the environment around there, which would actually be a major threat to the health and life of the Russian troops and the Ukrainian troops and the staff there, and might make it hard to maintain control of the reactors. This is very dangerous missions, and on everybody's side, and hopefully that none of them will actually be. We don't want another Chernobyl. And this is one of the dangers of this crazy war. I mean, it's a very, totally unfortunate thing. I think it's a massive mistake on the part of the Russians. I think to do this, I mean, they're suffering tremendous economic sanctions, and even when this war ends, I don't think these sanctions just go away. They are going to be around, and so. But the thought occurs to me, maybe this actually does appeal to Putin also. I mean, the more Russia becomes a consumer class, more westernized country, relying on, a more middle class lifestyle, the more likely that his regime will be seen as something that's repellent, and there'll be more likelihood of people to, rebel against it or oppose it. And so maybe that's kind of what is going on here partly also, as he wants to reestablish control. I mean, doesn't the economic embargo and Western companies pulling out of Russia lead to effectively those facilities being nationalized by the Russian government effectively, or maybe sold off to cronies? I don't know which, they're still there. I mean, the money that's been invested there doesn't go away just because the value of the stock in it goes away, that they already have the capital that they have. And this is not, in the Stalinist period, there was a lot of Western investment, I believe, in the 20s, until Stalin got in and, kind of went hard socialist, communist on them, So, what Putin's reaction to this is and whether it really brings them down or not. I mean, there is a possibility there'd be a coup against Putin. But on the other hand, the people around Putin that hold the levels of power probably are so invested in Putin succeeding that if he falls, they fall too. If he goes on trial, they go on trial too. And it's kind of like a mafia-like thing, where they all either hang together or they all hang separately. And so I don't know that Lindsey Graham's hope is going to be realized. We don't know. I mean, it is true if he was overthrown, this would be a chance for a diplomatic opening, perhaps, unless Russia went totally unstable and became even more dangerous, which is another problem. In a lot of ways, I think that the Western reaction to this whole crisis as it was building up was completely wrong in so many ways. I mean, for one thing, we didn't deploy any forces until the war actually broke out. Even Ukraine didn't call up its reserves until the war actually broke out. I mean, which is itself is kind of interesting. And the other thing is, our side apparently, did not make any concessions to the Russians. I mean, you need to have, on the one hand, strength to show you can't oppose them, but you also have to have some flexibility. And I think that Russia felt that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with a weak leadership like Biden. It was an opportunity for him to move, and he took it. And now we're stuck with this situation, and worst of all, of course, the Ukrainian people are stuck with this situation, which is only getting worse. And it doesn't seem like it's going to leave. It's going to end up with Ukraine left in ruins, and then we'll see what happens afterwards. Is kind of what we're heading toward. At any rate, that's kind of my comments today on the subject. I don't know. We'll have to see what happens next. I guess. And until next time. By the way, my links to my social media accounts, the link, but the addresses are there and the identification of which ones. And then I do post these things on Rumble also, although it's not my primary posting. I do get some views over there, and it's always good to have a backup channel, so to speak. So until next time.